Hey guys, tonight we dive into the complete history of the AIDS epidemic, the 20th century plague. From the first baffling cases in 1981 to the breakthroughs that turned fear into treatment, prevention and hard-won hope. If that's the journey you came for, you're in the right place. Before we settle in, tap like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing our little midnight map light up across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background and breathe with me. We're going to move slowly, gently, and truthfully. Picture this: fluorescent corridors, a stack of x-rays like pale moons, and a short, dry paragraph dated June 5, 1981, in a CDC bulletin that most people never read. In Los Angeles, young men, supposed to be in the bright noon of their lives, arrived with infections that belonged to textbooks about extreme immune suppression. Across the country, New York physicians saw purple lesions leap from footnotes to emergencies. No panic in the prose, just a clinical whisper that would change everything. The early labels were wrong, the rumors were loud, and the stigma was louder. But the real story is bigger than any headline. Scientists chasing a retrovirus no one had seen before. Activists teaching a nation to listen, patients becoming architects of modern medicine, and a global fight to turn access into life. No graphic images tonight, no shock for shock's sake, just clear, careful storytelling that honors the people who lived it. So pull the blanket up to your chin, let your shoulders drop, and come with me to the first clue in this long, luminous mystery, Los Angeles, spring of 1981, where a physician notices a pattern, and a century learns a new word for courage. Part 1. Whispers in Fluorescent Light, Los Angeles, 1981. The night in Los Angeles was the color of a hospital corridor, cool, humming, and brighter than it needed to be. In that light, an immunologist named Dr. Michael Gottlieb kept noticing something his textbooks could not explain. Young men, bright as new coins, arrived with fevers that clung like damp fog and coughs that rattled like keys in a locked door. Their bodies, primed by every ordinary measure, behaved as if some invisible hand had turned down the volume of their immune defenses. On x-rays, the lungs bloomed with a ghostly haze. The diagnosis, the rare fungal pneumonia PCP, pneumocystis, usually belonged to patients whose immunity had been deliberately suppressed for transplants or blasted by chemotherapy. But these men had no such histories. Their immune systems were collapsing from within, quiet as snowfall, relentless as tide. Across the continent in New York, dermatology and oncology clinics began to see a different omen: Kaposi's sarcoma, rushing like fire through the bodies of young men. Not the indolent, scattered lesions of elderly patients in the old literature, but a new, fulminant storm that marked skin, mouth, lungs, and lymph nodes. The rulebook whispered curiosity. Reality replied catastrophe. In Atlanta, the CDC received fragments of this puzzle: odd infections in Los Angeles, aggressive cancers in New York, each message a bead of rain on an unseen window. One thread bound the early cases. Most were gay men. And so, in prose as spare as a telegram, the MMWR on June 5, 1981 marked a point on medical history's map. 5 cases of PCP in Los Angeles. Another MMWR soon followed, noting clusters of Kaposi's sarcoma in New York and California. Outside the journals, the news traveled by rumor and by night. A purple mark on a forearm. A hospitalization that didn't end. Dance floors where the base once promised dawn now felt haunted. People searched for simple culprits: poppers, bathhouse plumbing, a mutant syphilis, because a small answer is easier to hold than a truth with no edges. Meanwhile, the count rose quietly, and behind the numbers, a feeling coalesced like frost on glass. We are being hunted by something we cannot yet name. The first story of any plague is not discovery. It's recognition. It is the moment a pattern steps out of the corner of your eye and asks to be believed. In 1981, America looked up from its morning sunshine to find a shadow on the wall. Part 2. Naming the phantom from grid to AIDS language builds rooms for our fears to live in. The first room was called GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, a label of convenience that hardened fast into a wall. GRID fit the early pattern: It also misled the world. Names don't just describe. They define, and grid defined the illness as a fate tied to identity, rather than an infectious agent moving through blood and sex and needles. Reality refused the box. Strange, confounding cases appeared. Heterosexual people who injected drugs. Haitian immigrants far from New York's nightlife. Hemophiliacs whose lifeline, Factory 8, pooled from thousands of donors, slowly turned into a conduit for an unknown pathogen. 20-month-old child sick after transfusions. The logic sharpened to a single terrifying line. The blood supply itself could carry the phantom. In meeting rooms where coffee cooled beside ashtrays, the CDC argued to screen donors with blunt questions and to heat-treat blood products. The blood industry, fearing shortages, costs, and lawsuits, hesitated. Committees convened. Memos multiplied. The virus kept its own calendar. By 1982, the working name AIDS, Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, was adopted. Each word mattered. Acquired, not inborn. Immune deficiency, the body's shield buckling. Syndrome, a constellation of illnesses with a cause not yet pinned to the board. The renaming did not end stigma, but it corrected the compass. This was not retribution. This was contagion. Hospitals learned to fear their own miracles. A blood bag, once a symbol of deliverance, now carried the rumor of doom. People delayed surgeries, banked their own blood, or fled the fluorescent glow of operating rooms entirely. Not until 1985, after scientists isolated the virus, first called LAV in Paris, HTLV3 in Bethesda, and finally HIV, did a reliable antibody test spread across the land, making the blood supply safer at last. But for thousands, the calendar had already closed. The naming of AIDS did not banish darkness. It gave darkness a boundary, and within that boundary, a path to follow. Part 3. The Virus Revealed, Paris, Bethesda, and a Bitter Truce. In a fourth-floor lab at the Pasteur Institute, patience is a method. Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, meticulous and steady, coaxed cells from a lymph node to live in a dish, and waited for a chemical whisper, reverse transcriptase, the calling card of a retrovirus writing itself into human DNA. The signal rose. Under electron microscopes, particles budded like moons from a cell's rim. The team, led by Luc Montagnier, called the culprit LAV, lymphadenopathy-associated virus. In 1983, they sent a flare into the scientific dark. We have isolated something new. Across the Atlantic, in Bethesda's bright corridors, Robert Gallo, giant in retrovirology, pushed toward another announcement, HTLV3, and a 1984 press conference where confidence strode across the stage beside political power. The virus had a face. A test was coming. A vaccine in 2 years, they said. Then the sequences spoke. The American virus and the French virus looked, for all intents and purposes, the same, and possibly the same sample, carried over oceans for confirmation and, through contamination or confusion, reborn as a separate discovery. Accusations followed like thunder. Patents, pride, nations. It took a 1987 summit between Reagan and Chirac to broker a truce. Shared credit, shared royalties, a fragile peace, science. Despite human drama, had what it needed. The enemy had a settled name, human immunodeficiency virus. With it came tools, antibody tests to secure blood, a molecular target for drugs, a map for epidemiology. The race had begun, not for applause, but for time. In the background, a quieter story unspooled. The CDC budget's too small for the fire at hand. Public health workers threading needles of data while funerals multiplied. A virus does not hate. It simply persists. People do the hating for it. And yet in laboratories, between pipettes and centrifuges, countermagic was learning the enemy's steps. Part 4. Silence in high places. Thunder in the streets. The White House had bright rooms and careful scripts. For years, the word AIDS never crossed the presidential lips in public. In the press room, jokes curdled in the air. Funding requests shrank. The epidemic, framed by some moralists as punishment, was allowed to burn without a federal bell to sound the alarm. Silence is not neutral. It is a wind that channels fire. Communities built their own sirens. The gay men's health crisis taught, comforted, carried. But the dying outpaced the casseroles, and grief tempered into a harder metal. Larry Kramer stepped onto a stage in 1987 like a messenger with ash on his sleeve and asked a city to choose: accept extinction or fight. 2 days later, ACT UP was born. AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a decentralized storm of committees, Monday meetings, and incandescent ingenuity. They read journal articles as if they were treasure maps. They learned how to choreograph a camera's gaze. They branded a truth into the city's concrete: a black field, a pink triangle flipped upward, and the words, silence, death. Wall Street felt their footsteps. Burroughs' Welcome faced a chorus for pricing the only approved AIDS drug like salvation behind glass. On October 11, 1988, they executed their most audacious ritual: seize control of the FDA. Not bombs, but binders. Not chaos, but a blueprint. Parallel track access. Compassionate use at scale. Trial designs that compared new drugs to the best available care, instead of placebo in a fatal disease. Inclusion of women, people of color, and IV drug users. They ringed the building with bodies in lab coats and evidence in their hands. Institutions that would not listen to screams learned to hear arguments. Doors cracked. Policies bent. The fortress of paternalism, that old cathedral of medicine, let the congregation into the nave. Power met power. Silence met its counterspell. And the country saw, on the evening news, not just victims, but strategists. Part 5, The Poisoned Chalice, AZT Retrovir. Hope can hurt. In 1964, chemist Jerome Horwitz synthesized a failed anti-cancer molecule, a mimic of DNA's building blocks meant to halt replication. Decades later, racing through dusty catalogs, researchers found it waiting like a key with a missing lock. Against HIV's reverse transcriptase, the drug, AZT, zidovudine, jammed the machinery. In a gold standard double-blind trial in 1986, the difference emerged so stark that monitors halted the study early. 19 deaths on placebo, 1 on AZT. In 1987, the FDA approved AZT with uncommon speed. The elation soon learned its limits. AZT was a savior with teeth, toxic to bone marrow, seeding anemia, nausea, headaches, wasting. The virus adapted. Single drug therapy gave it time to evolve. Meanwhile, the price, about $10,000 per year then, the most expensive prescription in history, walled off salvation from many who needed it most. The chant changed. Pills cost pennies. Greed costs lives. And yet even a flawed shield buys time. Time for activists to pry open trial designs. Time for scientists to sketch new classes of drugs. Time for a movement to train itself in the rituals of policy and the grammar of cameras. In hospital rooms where windows were taped against winter drafts, people counted days by pill bottles and marked small victories. A fever broken, an infection tamed, a friend's voice returning to color. The first weapon in a war is seldom elegant, but it can be enough to hold a line until the cavalry crests the hill. Please 6. Names. Faces and a country's reflection. The quilt. Ryan White, Magic Johnson. Grief needed a language the nightly news could not speak. In San Francisco, Cleve Jones found it in fabric. Panels, 3 by 6 feet, the size of a human grave, stitched from uniforms. Sequins, denim, wedding rings, teddy bears, and love letters became the AIDS memorial quilt. In 1987, the quilt unfurled on the National Mall, a silent city of color and sorrow, and volunteers read names until the light ran out of the sky. Statistics became touchable. Absence became art and accusation. Another language was a face. In Indiana, teenager Ryan White, infected through Factor VIII, simply wanted to return to school. Fear met him with bullets through windows, slurs on lockers, and courtrooms full of trembling misinformation. Ryan's steady grace on television, his eventual return to class, and his death in 1990 opened the nation's eyes. That same year, Congress passed the Ryan White Care Act, a lifeline of funds for those without insurance or wealth. Then came a thunderclap the size of an arena. On November 7, 1991, Irvin Magic Johnson told the world he had HIV and would retire from the Los Angeles Lakers. The nation inhaled as one. Phone lines to testing centers lit like constellations. The false comfort that AIDS lived only in the margins evaporated. Here stood a married heterosexual superstar, radiant with life, saying, "I will fight. I will live." He joined commissions, spoke from podiums, and redefined the image of HIV from a hospital bed to a public mission. The quilt gave the nation a way to weep. Ryan gave it a way to learn. Magic gave it a way to act. Together, they decoupled a virus from identity and reattached it to our common mortality and our common responsibility. Part 7. The Lazarus Conference, Vancouver, 1996. By the middle of the 1990s, hope felt like a shy animal that would not approach the bedrail. People learned a new rhythm of living, flare-ups and remissions, hospital bracelets and pill bottles that rattled like tiny hourglasses. The virus was a cunning clockmaker, always finding a way to advance the hands. Monotherapy, one drug at a time, could slow the mechanism but not stop it. Resistance arrived as surely as dawn. Then came Vancouver, July 1996, a gathering like any other in the program book and like no other in the air. The 11th International AIDS Conference opened with murmur and rumor, an electricity that lifted conversations into the rafters. On screens the size of billboards, graphs began to bend toward a different future. The new protease inhibitors, a class of medicines that stood at the assembly line's end and jammed the final step of viral production, had joined forces with older reverse transcriptase blockers. Researchers called the strategy combination therapy. Journalists would rename it HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy, as if the word itself were an incantation. The logic was elegant, almost musical. If the virus could dance around one melody, overwhelm it with 3 played at once, 2 nucleoside analogs to corrupt the script as it is being copied, and a protease inhibitor to prevent the copied parts from ever snapping together into infectious form. Mutation is statistics dressed as fate. The odds of escaping 3 locks simultaneously shrink from likely to vanishingly small. Viral loads in patients on these cocktails did not simply fall. They crashed, plunging below the threshold of standard detection. CD4 T-cell counts, those trembling gauges of the immune army's strength, stopped dropping, then began, like spring grass through hard soil, to rise. Outside the conference halls, people were dying. Inside, a word began to spread that felt blasphemous to despair: suppression. In clinics that had perfected the choreography of last goodbyes, something outlandish occurred. Fevers broke and did not return. Purple lesions faded from faces. Men and women who had written farewell letters stood up and asked sheepishly for their jobs back. The newspapers reached for scripture and found the metaphor already waiting. The Lazarus effect. In the United States alone, between 1996 and 1997, AIDS-related deaths fell by nearly half. It was the steepest one-year decline for any major disease in modern history, a graph that looked like a cliff over which grief was finally not being pushed, but miracles have fine print. Early regimens demanded discipline bordering on monastic: 20, 30, sometimes 40 pills a day, some with food, some without, some at midnight with an alarm that carved sleep into shards. Adherence wasn't a virtue, it was a survival mechanism, because even a short vacation invited the virus to return wearing new armor. Side effects were the toll: nausea, diarrhea, an unforgiving metabolic trick called lipodystrophy that moved fat from face and limbs to belly and neck, transforming bodies into maps of their own treatment. And then there was cost, a tall gate with thin hinges that kept too many outside. Clinicians learned to speak a new kind of truth to their patients. We cannot cure you yet. We can hold the dragon down as long as you stand on it with us. Patients learned a new covenant with their pillboxes. I will be here. You must be here too. The language of funerals did not vanish. It decrescendoed. The language of calendars returned. Plans returned. Futures, tattered, living, negotiable, returned. After Vancouver, there were still funerals, but there were also birthdays whose candles multiplied. Hope, in capital letters, moved from a poster on a ward to a protocol in a chart. The plague did not end. It changed shape. From a sprint toward death, it became a long, exacting walk with life. Part 8. A world divided: Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia. As champagne corks clicked softly in Western clinics, Another sound rose far from the microphones, the heavy hush of a continent in mourning. In sub-Saharan Africa, the virus had not arrived as a headline event. It came as mist and settled as drought, along trucking routes and in growing cities through heterosexual networks complicated by the daily arithmetic of survival. HIV moved faster than rumor and slower than policy. Prevalence in some nations climbed above 1 in 5 adults. In places like Botswana and Swaziland, life expectancy, once climbing like a steady hymn, fell backward into a kind of demographic winter. Cemeteries learned the names of the young. Grandmothers gathered grandchildren like a country gathers its flags after war. When healthcare workers died, clinics faltered, making it harder to protect those who kept them open, which made more clinics falter. Each loss loosened the nuts on the next wheel. Orphans multiplied, not as an abstraction but as backpacks hung on small shoulders in long lines for maize. In villages where everyone was needed for planting, the fields stood half-sown. A virus turned farmers into patients. Thinning harvests turned patients into famine's apprentices. This is what epidemics do when the map behind them is poverty. They braid disasters into ropes. Stigma became a second pathogen. In communities where silence already sheltered other traumas, people vanished into their illnesses rather than be seen. Prevention campaigns struggled against rumor, fear, and the haunting calculus of bargaining with partners, with custom, with hunger. Leadership mattered, and not all leaders met the mirror well. In South Africa, public arguments about the nature of the disease and the safety of modern drugs delayed a national response precisely when action would have saved hundreds of thousands. Garlic and beetroot entered the discourse where antiretrovirals should have reigned. Years passed and numbers did what they do when untended. They grew. The fire was not only African. In Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, the social Rubik's Cube of the 1990s spun into new alignments that left public health systems cracked and funding thin. Injecting drug use surged. The virus found a superhighway in shared needles. In certain cities, prevalence among people who inject drugs leapt from near zero to a terrifying majority within a few years. Prisons became amplifiers. Clinics counted what they could while their scales slid on uneven floors. In Asia, the epidemic wore many faces at once. Thailand adopted a bold prophylaxis program in its commercial sex industry and bent curves downward. In Cambodia and Myanmar, destabilized by conflict and poverty, infections climbed. The vastness of India and China turned low national prevalence into millions of lives at stake. Epidemics flickered differently in each region. Sex work here, migration there, drug use corridors somewhere else. Prevention had to be a tapestry, not a banner. Treatment, a supply chain that crossed mountains and megacities and everything between. At the heart of the problem was a simple arithmetic of injustice. Heart worked, but its price was a barbed wire wrapped in silk. Where per capita incomes were counted in hundreds, $10,000 to $15,000 a year, was the same as never. It took a change in global weather to move the clouds. Activists in Africa put on T-shirts that read HIV positive and refused to be shamed. Lawsuits and marches drew cameras to boardrooms. When 39 pharmaceutical companies tried to block South Africa from importing cheaper medicines, the optics snapped like a trap. They withdrew. In India, generic manufacturers proved the unprovable by offering a 3-in-1 pill for $1 a day. The argument that costs could not fall evaporated. Then the world built new instruments. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria in 2002, and the United States' vast PEPFAR program in 2003, which poured logistics and medicine into countries starved of both. The wall did not crumble in an afternoon, but doorways appeared. Clinics were built, nurses trained, warehouses cooled, trucks fueled, supply chains charted like rivers. The Lazarus effect crossed oceans, sometimes late, sometimes uneven, yet undeniably present. A mother rising from bed, a teacher returning to a chalkboard, a field planted on time. The same science, now accompanied by a different politics, transformed tragedy's scale. The virus had not changed. We had Part 9, Patients Become Architects, Trials, the FDA, and a New Medicine. For a century, medicine's architecture resembled a cathedral. At the altar, physicians and researchers performed rites of knowledge. In the pews sat patients instructed to be present, patient, and grateful. The FDA guarded the doors with a long key, years of trials, phases stacked like stained glass, and a doctrine that gold standard truth was minted in double-blind placebos, whether or not a disease was sprinting through the population. ACT UP did not burn the cathedral. They learned its floor plan. In living rooms scented with coffee and urgency, the Treatment and Data Committee formed a school with no dean and a curriculum of survival. Artists and stockbrokers, writers and paralegals, men and women who were sick, taught themselves virology, pharmacology, biostatistics. They read the New England Journal of Medicine the way sailors read the sky. They learned why the early AZT trials had been designed as they were, and exactly how such designs could exclude the very people who needed answers most: women, people of color, intravenous drug users, anyone with the messy bodies real life produces. Armed with fluency, the activists engineered a pivot from protest to policy proposal. The masterpiece was the parallel track. While a drug climbed the slow staircase of Phase 2 and the 3 trials, people who could not meet the strict inclusion criteria, or who lived far from trial sites, should still be allowed access under structured, monitored programs. Compassion would no longer be a whisper at a physician's discretion. It would be architecture. Placebos, they argued, were immoral when no effective therapy existed. New drugs should be tested against the best standard of care, not sugar. Trials should include the full tapestry of those affected, or they risked producing truths that did not travel. They brought these arguments not only to sidewalks and cameras, but into conference rooms, where Dr. Anthony Fauci and others at the NIH listened, argued back, and, over time, changed. The FDA opened windows for expanded access, accelerated surrogate endpoints, and adaptive designs that reflected the urgency outside. Community advisory boards were established. Patients took seats on panels that used to convene without them. The singular genius of this chapter was not the toppling of expertise, but its marriage to experience. The recognition that people living with a disease can sharpen the questions that save their lives. The legacy reached beyond AIDS, oncology. Trials began to inherit the ethics and flexibility born of ACT UP's pressure. Rare disease communities learned to speak science to power. Regulators adopted pathways that could move fast without abandoning rigor. And an old word, paternalism, lost its varnish. In its place stood a new model with more hands on the blueprint. The cathedral still stood, but its doors were propped open, its pews rearranged, its altar shared. When historians trace the decline in AIDS deaths to pills in bottles, they will be right but incomplete. The pills arrived because activists built a bridge from grief to governance and walked across it, carrying the scientists with them. Part 10. The Blue Shield from PEP to PrEP. In hospitals, accidents have their own liturgy. A needle stick, a sharp intake of breath, a report, a stopwatch started. For years, the doctrine was PEP, post-exposure prophylaxis, a month of antiretrovirals begun within hours of a possible exposure, meant to hound the virus before it could unpack its suitcase inside the nucleus of a cell. It worked often enough to counsel hope and rarely enough to forbid complacency. But PEP was a fire extinguisher. The question that haunted the hallways was simpler and braver. Could we fireproof the room? The proposed answer was PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, a daily pill that would bathe vulnerable tissues in a medicine strong enough to block HIV at the door. The candidate was known and trusted. Truvada, a combination of tenofovir and emtricitabine, already a cornerstone in treatment cocktails. To shift it from therapy to shield, the proof would have to be immaculate. You cannot ethically expose someone to a virus to see if your idea works. You must build a trial the world can believe. That trial was IPREX-C, launched in 2007, spanning continents: Peru, Ecuador, South Africa, Brazil, Thailand, the United States, and enrolling nearly 2,500 participants, primarily HIV-negative men who have sex with men, with some transgender women. Everyone received robust prevention services, frequent testing, counseling, condoms. Half received Truvada. Half received a placebo indistinguishable in shape and shade. The study asked not whether behavior could be perfected, none can, but whether a pill could place a powerful thumb on the scale of risk. On November 23, 2010, the results rose like a tide through headlines. Among participants who took their pill consistently, risk dropped by about 92%. Counting everyone assigned to the Truvada arm, including those who struggled with adherence, the reduction was still profound. For the first time since latex, a biomedical barrier offered itself to the world. And unlike latex, it could protect even when the moment's heat or fear or negotiation frayed human intention. But every gift arrives with the culture that receives it. Some activists and clinicians welcomed PrEP as a long-awaited instrument. Others feared it would usher in a complacency that abandoned condoms and invited other STIs. The internet birthed a slur. Moral rhetoric briefly reclaimed a microphone it had not earned. Money intruded. In the United States, a month of Truvada without insurance carried a price tag that turned yes into not for you, for many who most needed it. Public health departments learned new bureaucratic acrobatics to braid assistance programs with clinics and pharmacies so that cost would not decide who got to be safe. And then the real-world data spoke. Cities that embraced PrEP, San Francisco, London, Sydney, began to report historic declines in new infections. Clinics reframed the STI debate. Detection rose because testing rose. Prevention needed to be a package, not a purity ritual. PrEP plus testing plus vaccination, plus conversations honest enough to hold real desire. The old fight about whether people deserved protection lost air. The virus, indifferent to opinion, yielded to pharmacology plus public health. In 2012, the FDA approved Truvada for PrEP. The shield, properly used, was more than a metaphor. It was a daily act of agency, a decision to reject destiny in favor of chemistry. The goal was not to replace wisdom with pills. It was to give wisdom a sturdier stage. And as clinics handed out that small blue tablet, a deeper truth glimmered at the edges. The most radical thing in prevention is access. Pill cannot protect a pocket it never reaches. Part 11. Keys to the locked room toward a cure. Treatment is a truce. A cure is the locked room in the castle, the place every quest promises and every realist doubts. IV hid its most devious trick in plain sight. As a retrovirus, it sows its code into the genome of long-lived cells and then goes quiet. A latent reservoir that antiretrovirals cannot see and the immune system cannot hunt. Stop therapy and the dragon wakes, wing-stretching in a week. Many wondered if the room could be opened at all. Then an American living in Berlin, Timothy Ray Brown, walked a tightrope between two illnesses. He had HIV controlled by drugs and then an unrelated but lethal enemy, acute myeloid leukemia. His oncologist proposed a stem cell transplant, a therapy so brutal it erases an immune system to build another. And then came the audacious addendum. What if the donor carried the rare CCR5D32 mutation, which removes a critical co-receptor that most strains of HIV use like a doorknob? If Brown's new immune cells lacked that knob, could the virus, even if it lingered, find no door left to enter? They found such a donor. In 2007, chemotherapy and radiation leveled Brown's hematologic house to its foundations. Donor stem cells repopulated the rooms. He stopped antiretrovirals. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The most sensitive tests could not find replicating virus. Brown, the Berlin patient, was declared cured. It was not a blueprint for billions. Transplants are perilous and reserved for malignancies, not prophylaxis. But it demolished the word impossible. The locked room, it turned out, had a key. Scientists burst through a new set of doors. One corridor was labeled shock and kill. If the reservoir is invisible because it is sleeping, wake it with latency-reversing agents. Then sick the immune system, possibly trained by a therapeutic vaccine, on those now visible cells. Early studies showed the shock is feasible. Arranging the kill everywhere the virus hides remains a meticulous, unfinished craft. Another corridor glittered with gene tools, CRISPR-Cas9 and zinc finger nucleuses that could edit CCR5 in a patient's own T cells, then reinfuse those cells to patrol with doors removed. It is elegant, expensive, and young, but youth in science is a synonym for watch this space. At the far end of the maze stood the oldest dream, a vaccine. HIV wears a carnival of disguises, changing its outer coat so swiftly that antibodies arrive to find the party already moved. Yet in a small subset of people, the immune system eventually scripts broadly neutralizing antibodies that can recognize conserved shapes on many HIV strains. The new ambition is to teach that response from the first shot, to stepwise prime and boost the immune system toward a choreography few bodies learn unaided. It is a moonshot, yes, but the moon, history reminds us, is not as far as it looks when technology and stubbornness conspire. The cure frontier is not a headline, but a ledger of incremental gains. Each trial that fails narrows the field. Each partial success stitches a detail into the spellbook. The world learned during the plague's darkest years to respect what patience and pressure can do together. We will need both to open the room entirely, and then lock it behind the departing dragon. Part 12. The Living Epilogue. Memory, Mercy, and the Work That Remains. Decades after the first MMWR bulletin, the numbers sit like stones. More than 35 million dead. Tens of millions living with the virus still today. In wealthy cities, HIV has become a manageable chronic condition. Not easy, not cheap, but compatible with careers, parenthood, and plans that stretch beyond a season. In many other places, villages in sub-Saharan Africa, neighborhoods in Eastern Europe, counties in the American South where clinics are far and stigma heavy, the old story repeats with smaller microphones and thinner budgets. The science is not the barrier now. The scaffolding of access is. What remains from the plague years is not a single lesson, but a braid. One strand is science. Patient, brilliant, wrong, and then right, grinding through mechanisms until molecules behave like allies. Another is activism. Inconvenient, loud, luminous, with love for the living, able to wring change from institutions that mistake caution for virtue. The third is voice. Patients becoming partners, bringing their diaries to the dais, insisting that trials reflect a world with women, with people of color, with drug use, with poverty, with complicated lives that do not pause for pristine datasets. Take any one strand away and the rope does not hold. The epidemic taught countries to build supply chains like arteries. It taught hospitals to experiment with compassionate access. It taught regulators to move faster without forgetting what rigor is for. It taught the media how to mourn without scandalizing, and the public how to care without condescension. It taught medicine that paternalism is a beautiful word for a broken idea. And it taught us what silence costs. Silence at death was not simply a poster. It was an equation that held true from press rooms to parish halls to parliament, wherever the decision to look away masqueraded as neutrality. If there is wonder still to be found in this story, it is not in the virus's cruelty, though biology can be cruel. It is in the fact that people built so many different kinds of bridges over the same chasm. Quilters stitched grief into names you could touch. Teenagers like Ryan White taught a nation to distinguish between fear and facts. Champions like Magic Johnson showed that a diagnosis could be public without being a surrender. Scientists in Paris and Bethesda and everywhere else followed signals fainter than whispers. Nurses held hands no one else would hold. Lawmakers signed bills that traded indifference for infrastructure. Somewhere, a bus driver took a cheaper generic pill because a stranger in India decided to price it at $1 a day. The final chapter has not been written, but the genre is clear. This is not tragedy alone. It is a pilgrimage with mile markers carved by millions. Some walked only a little way before their names were sewn into a square of cloth. Others are still walking, daily, swallowing a small chemistry that keeps the dragon sleeping. On the road ahead lie cures we can describe but not yet deploy, vaccines that exist as sketches, policies that could equalize what is now uneven. On the roadside sit the same temptations that slowed us before: stigma, fatigue, budget lines that look tidy on paper and cruel in life. We live in an age that has already seen another pandemic. The AIDS years stand behind our shoulders like a tutor who survived a hard school. They whisper, listen early, fund public health, protect the vulnerable, be humble about what you do not know, and never ever mistake a group for a threat when the threat is the pathogen itself. They also remind us of the oldest countermagic: community, The way people appear for one another when institutions are slow. The way love becomes logistics when it has to. Some nights, if you walk past a storage facility where the AIDS memorial quilt sleeps between its journeys, you might feel a change in the temperature of the air. That is not haunting. It is witness. The panels are not relics of defeat. They are proof that memory can be made heavier than prejudice. The story of this plague, its beginnings in fluorescent light, its years of rage and research, its redemptions partial and hard-won, now belongs to everyone because it always did. And that may be the most wondrous truth of all, that in the face of a virus which taught us how fragile breath is, we learned how strong a shared breath can become when millions exhale the same vow. We will not be silent.